This lesson is going to be a JavaScript refresher, showing you and demonstrating how to create elements, as well as how to create interaction and click events on elements that are on the page, and then manipulations for the style contents of the elements, and how we can use conditions and JavaScript to create interactions for web users. So we've got a number of things that are happening here, and if we click this, then this is going to add in another page element. We also have a count value for the page content, so that's updating as well. And we're also adding in the event listeners on each one of these newly created elements dynamically. So they all are either adding or removing the box class. So it's toggling the class when it does get clicked, and that's where you see the red background and the blue font. The H1 is updating its text content. The input field is going to be updating its data type, its type. So going from number to text, that gets toggled. The click me button is going to be generated dynamically with JavaScript code. So we're using the document create element method. And this is also going to have an event listener where it's going to add the content that's contained within the input field and create a new div out of it. So that div has now just been added to the bottom of the web page elements. A selection of some of the elements on the page. So is what we learned in the last lesson, where we can use the document object, and in this case we want to select both of the divs, so we're going to use query selector all for this, and selecting each one of the matching selectors. So that gives us both of the divs within the selection, and for divs using for each will loop through and return back each item within the node list as a div. And for now we can just console log it out just to make sure that we've selected the elements properly before we try to make a manipulation of the element. So now we're referencing that each element as div within the JavaScript code. So that means that we can make some updates to it, and we can update some of the text content that's contained within that element by using the text content property. So setting that to, if we want to say hello world, we can add that, and that will output hello world. We can also reference and return back the index value, so concatenating the index value to hello world. So that will output those values. And another method that we're going to use, what we're going to use in the upcoming lessons, is going to be the backticks, so the template literals. So this allows us to write JavaScript string values without having to worry about the different quotes. And if we want to include a variable, we can include it this way. And if we want to add some JavaScript code, we can include it that way as well. So we're outputting, and then within the curly brackets, if I was to add 1 to this, then that would do the formula here where we're taking the value of index plus 1, and then that's the end result that we're outputting on the page. We can also update the inner HTML. So if we take the div and we set its inner HTML, and this can also take a string parameter. So for instance, if we wanted to have hello world wrapped within an H2, and for now we won't do the inner HTML. So that outputs it. If we're doing text content, it simply outputs it as text content. I'm going to wrap the view so that we can see the full code. So if I was to take the same value and instead use div inner HTML, it will format the code as HTML for that element and output it onto the page, the result. There's also, if we have inputs, so I'm going to add an input here and set the type as text and set the value of hello. So if we want to select the input, let's do a selection and get the input value, and using the document query selector, and because we only got the one input that we're selecting, we can make that selection. We can also be more specific, so if we wanted to select it with a class, and typically you might see that with a class as well. So let's add in a class value here. And I'll give it a class of val. So if we want to select it with the class, we can do that as well. And once we select the element as a variable value, then we can interact with it. So if we want to get the contents that are contained within the value, we can select the in value and get its property value. And this is going to return back whatever the current value, input value is. So if I was to now write it, we get a value of hello v33, 333. So we can also, just as we can select the value, we can update the input value. So let's update the input value with whatever the value of index is. So it ends up at being 1 because it starts at 0 and then it's 1. And we can also dynamically select that value and use it within the JavaScript code. So that way we're concatenating to a string, and because we're adding to a string, that's where we get the 0, 1 and 1, 1. So we could convert this value actually to a number value, but by default coming from the input field, this is going to be a string value. Let's add ability to interact with the elements with click of the element. So adding an event listener. So first we need to select the element, and we'll select the H1. And then once we have it selected, then we can use it within the JavaScript code. So selecting the object, and then let's add an event listener. And then for the event listeners, there's a number of different event listeners that you can add. So the editor's giving me a full selection of all the different event listeners. And mainly we are going to be using the click event. And each event can pass over the event object. So you can capture the event object by typing in E. And the contents of the event object, right now we're just going to output it onto the console. So now whenever I click the H1 tag, we're capturing the event object, and the event object will give you information on what triggered the event and a whole bunch of information where it's located on the page for the element. And also when we look at event target, this will specify which element on the page initiated it. So if we do want to select the target, we can output the event target whenever it gets clicked, and that's going to reference whatever initiated the click. If we want to add an event to multiple items on the page, we can do that as we're looping through them. And just as we've got the div loop here, we can select the div object and add an event listener and add a click event to each one. So as it loops through, it's going to add the click event, and then we can output the target content as well. So let's see how that works. So when I click it, it's selecting the element that initiated the click, and it's outputting it on the page. If we select the output area, it also outputs those. So depending on which part of the element and which element is triggering the click event, we can output the target information on the page itself. So with the event listeners, we can do quite a bit where we can change the value of the output. So for instance, we can check to see if the current target or the H tag, if we only have the one element that's represented. So we can check to see if H tag text content is equal to JavaScript, and have a condition that if it is equal to JavaScript, then we'll update and change the content to equal to test. And otherwise, we're going to change it and equal it to JavaScript. So that will give us that toggling effect where we can, when we click on it, it can toggle the values there. You can also add classes, and we do have a class of box. So we're going to add in and we're going to toggle the class list on the event target. So in this case, it's a div. So either way, whether we use the eTarget or the div, it's going to be referencing the same element object from the DOM. So let's select the div, and then using the method class list, we can either add, we can remove, or we can toggle a class. So we're going to toggle the class of box. So every time it gets clicked, it's going to either add or remove the class from the element. And going into the live view of the current content and see it being updated, we're adding the classes and we're removing the classes. In addition to the classes, there's a lot that we can do with the elements and the element manipulation. So one of the other things that we're going to be doing in the upcoming lessons is we're going to be updating the style properties. So let's, once this element gets clicked, we're going to update the color of the H tag. So H tag and set the style properties. And this is another object that has a lot of different property values. So under style, we can update the background color. And if we want to do the background color to red when it gets clicked. And you can also have this toggling effect where we can have different values depending on if it gets toggled and clicked. We can also update the color value. So if we wanted the color, and using either the hex or the named values, so all of them are available for us. We can also update the attribute types. So let's select the in value, and we'll add an event listener to the in value. And if it's, we'll just keep click as well. So whenever it gets clicked, we're going to take the input and we'll update the attribute type. So we can get the attribute, so we'll console log, and using a method from the in value, from the element, and get attribute, and the attribute that we want to get is type. So that's going to, right now it's going to output into the console. So let's go back to the console, clear the console. So whenever we click it, we can get the attribute type. And we saw from before, if we can have a method to get it, we can also set it. So let's do a condition where if the attribute type is equal to text, which we saw in the console it is, then we're going to change it, and we'll change the attribute type of in value using set attribute and set the type, and we'll set the type to number. And otherwise, we'll set it back to text. So this is going to actually toggle the type of input. So let's look at that on the bigger screen. So as we're clicking it, it's updating the type. And you can also see, so the type is down here within the HTML. And as we're clicking it, we're updating the type. And then there's also the different properties for the type. So when we've got the number, then we've got the indicators to go up or down. And if we've just got the text, then we don't have the indicators. So that's the text type. You can also make it bigger if you want as well. So if we wanted to take the H tag and apply the style, and let's do text, and actually let's do font size. So 3EM. And also if we want to apply it to in value, then we just need to change the element that we're making the updates to. So now we've got the input field with a different size. And just as we saw, we can select elements, we can also append and create elements dynamically with code. So if we want to add in a button just next to the input, or if we want to append it to the output, we can do that as well, where we can select the element and add, creating a brand new element for the page. So let's add a button. So this is the name, and then using the document and create element method, specify the type of element that we want to create. And if I console log out button, see that we're creating a button, but we don't have it on the page yet. You can also add text content to the button, and this will just say click me. So the button is created, so the button object is created, but it's not on the page yet. In order to add it to the page, we need to specify where exactly we want to add it. So adding it to the page and whatever element we want to append it to. So if we want to append it to the H1 tag or whatever, for whatever reason, and add the button into the H1, we can use the append method and add the object to the H1. So that will append the content into the H1, and we are updating the inner HTML of H1 when we click it, so that's why it's disappearing there. So right now the button is there when the page loads. When I click it, we're updating the H1, and that's why it's being removed. So let's create another element on the page that we're not updating. So this can be, and I'll just create a span there. So make a selection of the span. So this is just our one span. And because I am updating the divs, interest of creating a brand new element, and now that we've got the element object, let's append the button to the span instead of the H tag. So there's our button appended to the span. And if we want to make the button clickable, just as we did before with the add event listener, we can add the event listener. And then whenever it gets clicked, whatever we want to do with the click. So in this case, maybe what we want to do is create a new element, a new div, append it to the body of the document. So let's do that, where we'll create a new div, and using the document, create element, and the element type tag that we're using is creating a div, and then the new div. So you can also use the document body and append to the document body, and we'll append the new div. And because this is an object, so we can update the content afterwards as well, and it will be reflected into the div that was appended. So let's take the content, we'll add in text content, and this content is going to be whatever we have within the input value at this current time. So it's just going to append that to the page. So now it's adding in a bunch of the divs. If we look at the page content, we've got a bunch of divs that now are appended to the page. If we have a value for something like a counter, so every time we click it, we'll increment counter, we'll reset the value, or actually we can append the div content, and using the backticks, so wrap it with the curly brackets, and let's output the value of counter within that element as well. So now we're adding a bunch of divs there. And also notice that it's only these elements that were the original divs on the page that have the event listener, because we added the event listener afterwards within the for each. So there's another way to do this where we create a function, my click, and it's going to pass in the event object, and then we can take this content and run this function code. Instead of using the div, we need to use the target to toggle the box class, and then within the click event we can just add the click event, and then as we create the new divs, let's add the click event to these new divs. So that way all of the divs on the page will have the same functionality. So let's see if we can add the new divs. And now when we click the new divs, we're able to toggle the class on those elements. So there's the elements, and we can click it, and they're working the same way as the initial divs did, where we're able to toggle the classes on those elements. And there is a difference between append and append child. So with append, do a val1, and const val2. And for most of the lessons, we are going to be using the append child, but we can also append, or we're using append, not append child. And the difference between the two is that the append doesn't have a callback, whereas the append child does have a callback. So if we do val1, it comes back undefined, and val2 will reference that element that was appended. So that's another way to create the reference to the element. If you want to create another variable that references the element that was created, then you could use the append child method. So I know we've covered quite a bit, and this was meant as a refresher and a quick overview of the JavaScript code that we're going to be needing in the upcoming lessons in order to manipulate the page content with the JSON data and the JavaScript object contents.